an Unspoiled Network podcast.
This is Spoil Me, covering The Immortal Great Souls, Book 1, Bastion, Chapters 16 through 19. In these chapters, Scorio is in training, and he has got a teacher who is low-key hoping he will quit. For now, I'm starting to think that maybe this is a person who just needed an injection of hope in their lives, and that they'll be able to work together. Welcome to Spoil Me. Welcome to the show, everyone. I am Natasha. Thank you so much to Dan for commissioning this episode. Dan is here in the chat, and I just appreciate it that he's able to attend these. It's always nice when the person commissioning can answer questions and stuff, although I understand that's not always possible. These chapters are really fascinating because you get a lot of information about the way the magic system works here, and not just like the magic itself organically, but the way that society has structured use of magic and development of ability. And there was something that had been brought up in the last chapters that I didn't get a chance to touch on because I was basically running over time, as I do. And I want to kind of go back and mention it because Scorio eventually just tells Nightmare Lady, who we later find out is Naomi, his story about, the fact that he wasn't, that he was red listed and wasn't allowed to continue on. And I really thought there was something that he didn't ask the questions I wished he did. She mentions that sometimes people refuse the call, is the way that she puts it, of Bastion. And the fact that that's possible is very fascinating to me. That basically the Bastion system, I guess, is that what I want to call it, is such that you sign up for it, but eventually you can sort of choose to not exactly opt out, but you can try and renege on the contract. So yeah, here it is. The Archspire calls bound souls back into service. They explain that much to you. The Archspire is Bastion's the name of the place. The Archspire is specifically the name of the rebirth center, power core. I don't know what to call this. So yeah, it siphons off some of their power in the process, which it then gives to those who did best at the gauntlet. I've heard it said, the mightier the soul, the more they can resist the Archspire's summons if they so desire. It takes strength and desire both to refuse the call, supposedly. If you're born within a year of your death, you're either weak or willing. And the fact that this is the way that it works, I just think, tells us a lot about what Scorio is probably like. And there comes a point in these chapters where he's thinking about where he eventually got in terms of his power based on the titles that they said he possessed. And he's thinking to himself, I probably didn't start in the kind of situation I'm in now, though. And a big part of me wanted to be why do you think that's the case? Because frankly, if you're resisting being pulled back, to me, that says you already weren't really interested in participating in this whole thing. And grew to be a person whose priorities changed, and you decided that the values or goals or whatever of the Archspire and the Immortals wasn't what you wanted, or you maybe went through this process before and remembered what it took to get where you are, and that they red listed you and threw you in a prison, and you just weren't interested in going through that again, you know? So, like, I wouldn't make assumptions. That's all I'm saying, Scorio. Dan says, Naomi is such an incredible character. She's part of why I wanted you to cover this book. Dope. Bastion is the name of the city. The Archspire is the Rebirth Temple. Thank you, Dan. Oh, my God. Sometimes my brain just completely short circuits. So chapter 16 starts with Naomi starting her, like, she's training. I'm putting that with an asterisk, Scorio. But, like, later on, she admits that she was kind of hoping that he would quit because she doesn't actually know what she's doing. That she was sort of robbed of her opportunity to progress, and that there's like a combination here of lack of experience and also resentment and having a sort of chip on her shoulder about that. And I really want to like clarify, when I say chip on her shoulder, chip on the shoulder often is used in a derogatory sort of way, where when you say it, what you're implying is that a person is out of proportion irritated or angry, that they are bringing up the injustice done them too often, or relying on it as an excuse, or oversensitive. And I don't use it in that way. I wish that I had a better phrase, but that's something that kind of immediately you sort of get what I'm saying. When I say chip on your shoulder, I'm not trying to belittle what you're talking about or experiencing. I am just acknowledging that there is a particular sore spot for you that is difficult for you to overcome, that you know you can be overreactive to. There is nothing wrong inherently with acknowledging that that's the reality that you live with every day, and that that's a big factor in the way that you see the world. It's just, how do you then handle that and move forward from that? That's a different story. But I find people who use the word chip on their shoulder in a dismissive way to be really frustrating, because it sort of implies that, like, you should just let it go, that you're being unreasonable. And a lot of the time, that isn't a fair expectation. And so anyway, we'll get to her whole story a little bit later. But Naomi is starting this off kind of wanting to scare him off before they even do anything. And she's like, I'm going to be able to reveal the basics as I understand them, and then you're on your own. You're asking for a lifetime of pain and frustration with no guarantees you'll make it far. You can see your heart. Can you see the mana in the air? And this is when we find out that the clouds are all different types of metal, or maybe perhaps stone, because eventually there's a sapphire is what's in the vials, we find out. So I'm not really sure if that's what the mana is limited to, is just sort of like minerals. But as of right now, that's all we have heard about, really. And I think it's really interesting that, like, the ways in which, because this is cultivation magic, right? And everybody who creates a world with this kind of magic has to decide for themselves the way that mana is going to function. And in Cradle, there's a wide variety. You know, you've got fire aura that you can then convert, you know what I mean? Like, it's a whole other thing where there's every element, every sort of concept, like there's dream aura as well. They all have an aura that can be used basically like mana. And it's a huge variety that can change from moment to moment, really, based on what's going on. And here it seems like it's very dependent on the landscape, which I just think is really interesting. And it's sort of like tying in for me a little bit to Mistborn and how much the magic in Mistborn depends on certain metals. So this place that they are currently in, the ruins, only has a particular kind of aura, which is coal. And evidently that is not a type of mana that is very helpful or powerful, or the type that's going to help him get strong if he uses it. And the school that he got kicked out of apparently sits on a deposit of like iron mana. So they are able to like get a primo supply of really strong mana, and that is what gives them such an advantage right from the beginning. So his like ambitions here, trying to get this mana into his heart, as much as like it's a valid way to practice, she really tries to sort of impress upon him the fact that you may get to a point where you can ignite your heart, but you will have been stunted by using mana of this type. And while it may be better than nothing, it won't be the level that you want based on what his ambitions are. And the way that the training works with her trying to get him to pull the mana into his igneous heart, he like mentally has been using a sort of paddle to direct it, and she sort of laughs, but is like, I mean, that's funny, but it's not like inappropriate. You can do that. And she warns him that if you keep using that sort of mental imagery, you can get stuck, so that you become dependent on that sort of imagery in a way that won't serve you later on. So you have to be careful with the way that you decide to like move forward with training and how dependent you become on using that tool, because eventually you really want to reach a point where you can control the mana directly and you don't need a tool to funnel it at all. So then when he manages to finally pull some of the mana into his heart, he says, I did it. How do I ignite? Ignite? Scorio, you're decades away from igniting. Entire lifetimes. Wait, what? All right, maybe not decades, but you've got a long way to go. Look, you ignite your inner flame when you apply sufficient tension to your heart after saturating it with ambient mana. You just took a sip of the poorest mana in hell. I barely felt the reduction. You're nowhere near saturated. And even if you were, you'd then have to learn to hold on to the mana while applying tension. Tension. Though the fact that you're out here cheating your way to victory against me so as to learn this stuff bodes well for you, because tension is the friction we all feel between the object of our desires and the reality of our shortcomings. The greater your ambitions, the greater your frustration at failing to achieve them, and the greater the turmoil that will roil your igneous heart. It is the fundamental driver of every great soul's climb to power. It's why most can't make it past Dread Blaze, while only 1 in a million makes it to Imperator. Power comes to those who truly desire it, by means of the frustration they feel at not yet having achieved it. No matter what they say out loud, those who stop at Dreadblaze do so because they don't want more power. They have grown content. They achieve what they really want. Perhaps a little money, a little authority, some security, and stop striving for more. Because acquiring power takes work, Scorio. It takes pain and sacrifice and unyielding resolve. And once people attain as much power as they need to satisfy their inner ambitions, they stop growing. And I found this really interesting, and it's the sort of thing that's like, I believe that all of us sort of overestimate how much of a drive we have for the things we allegedly want. There are certainly those of us out there who are hungry for it and will fucking grind and do whatever we need to. But I think many of us are much more likely to like want more of a balance in the way we live. And I think that's the difference between people who become really particularly successful in one aspect of their lives, is that they do that at the expense of other aspects of their lives. And that's a choice that's valid. But I think most of us have a variety of things that we want to be directing our energy into. It's not just about success at work. We also want to enjoy our time with our families. We want to be able to indulge in our hobbies and be creative. We want to have downtime to relax. And then there are people for whom those things are not a factor. And they can take the energy that most of us would be putting into a variety of categories, and they funnel it all into one category, which is getting as far as they can in one particular facet of their lives. And while that is valid, I think there's a part of us that always feels like other people who get that successful are secretly finding an extra store of energy that we normals don't have access to, and that it's sort of like unfair that they're able to do what they do because they have it all. But the fact is, if you really look at the lives of people like that, they don't have it all. They've chosen where all of that energy gets directed to really specifically, and they've just made choices that we aren't necessarily willing to make because those other categories are very important to us. And it's just, it's part of what I've really started to understand as I grow older is that people with like incredible success in different areas of their lives, as much as I can envy that success sometimes, I have started to step back and recognize that I could also achieve that were I willing to give up X, Y, and Z. And I have made the choice not to do that. And I don't regret that choice. So where I'm at is actually where I want to be, because I've decided to make the choices I have. And I make those choices repeatedly. So anyway, this whole thing comes down to, with Scorio, that he has this intense ambition without a real focus for it. Because the fact that he wants to like learn and grow, but doesn't, even earlier when he was thinking about like to what end, the best he could come up with is to just be like, well, I'll show them. And it's kind of something, but it's not really enough. And he doesn't have a place to zero in on, well, I'm getting power so that I can achieve this thing. The power is just at the moment for the sake of it. And I think it's really interesting that we have a character who is wanting power without a specific drive, at least a drive that he is aware of. This is something that can be categorized as greed, but is it, if it's not meant to be like, I want to take it away from other people? He wants power because who cares why? He wants it. And I always find it kind of fun when there's somebody like, I'm going to make comparisons to Cradle because of that being the only other cultivation magic series that I have covered for Spoil Me. But Lyndon is a similar character in that he just wants as much as he can get. And it is greed. It is a hunger, but it isn't an inherently negative trait unless you want to like count the fact that he himself will kind of never be quite satisfied as negative. And I guess it could be. But Scorio being allowed to just like want, without there being necessarily at this point some kind of noble goal that he's reaching for, is interesting to me. Sorry. Dan is in the chat. Cole is like snorting meth, not the best way to stay healthy long term. Progression in this series is interesting. It's much more physical concepts like tension in the heart than the more metaphysical stuff in a lot of progression fantasy. That makes me think of the story I've heard of college football coaches who have lived somewhere for a decade and don't know their home address. Being good at something requires sacrifices and dedication that aren't worth it to a lot of people. Is it greed, or is it just something he can't remember because he lost his memories, but it's inherent? Well, and that's the question, right? Like, how much does the personality that you had stick with you even when your memories are gone? Because for most of us, our personalities are formulated by our experiences, and there are certain things that are innate, like, you know, a lot of us showed tendencies toward the type of personality we have today from when we were very small children, and that wasn't necessarily just from the way we were raised. It was something that was in us already. But what he's like dealing with a lot is rage, this feeling of anger that overwhelms, that he really has to like kind of get a hold of. And that has to come from somewhere. You know, anger isn't a personality trait. Anger is an emotion that comes as a reaction to things. So where is that coming from? And from the way he's been treated, that's a perfectly valid source. You know, his anger at the way that he has been. But that's not the source, because this started in the Gauntlet, where there was a point and he feels anger and embraces it, and it feels very familiar to him. And as somebody who really struggles with anger herself, watch out, because anger is a really tricky thing to try and handle and harness, and it can easily overwhelm you. So let's see. He says, so you're happy at Emberling, and she says, we're not talking about me. Which I was like, we should be, though. And we eventually do. Is it the coal mana that will limit me? Indirectly, yes. The coal mana is crude, hard to work. You might even grow stronger by limiting yourself to it, but your control will be abysmal. In the academy, they artificially help their students pack their hearts with astounding amounts of pure, high-density mana. They can saturate themselves to the point of stupidity and ignite at absurdly high levels, setting the baseline of the hearts miles ahead of where they might otherwise get. You'll be sipping coal for years, exhausting the local supplies too quickly to build up a deep reservoir. And when he looks at her, she says, you asked me to teach you, not lie to you. So they have, like, they go on about whether he'd be able to ignite, the way that different hearts vary, and some of them can be deeper than others. Some can be more reactive than others. And what about the blue vials? That's better mana, right? It is, but they're mine, not yours. What if I train in areas of better mana, like where there's that reddish-brown kind? Or find hidden pockets of iron mana? Hidden pockets of iron mana? She grinned. Why don't you snatch up piles of forgotten elixirs while you're at it? Fine, but the reddish-brown mana, copper mana, whatever. What if I train where there's copper mana? Would that make enough of a difference? First, those locations are hard to find and carefully protected, but sure. Say you find a way to train where there's copper. You'd still have to take into account its regeneration rate, as you need a lot to saturate your heart, and would quickly use up a single location's reserves. But yes, it would help. It won't be enough to give you more than an average to weak heart. The baseline for every great soul is enhanced iron from the academy. You'll be locking yourself in at weak copper. You'll be disadvantaged for the rest of your life. And it mentions a few times that she's smirking, that her eyes are glittering. And what I really believe is happening here, and this is like something that I truly and deeply understand, but also needs to stop. I believe that Naomi has been so repeatedly disappointed and beaten down by the reality of the world and how unfair it is, how much she was promised versus how much she was given, the help that she should have had, and the fact that none of this is structured fairly, that she wants to see Scorio react the way that she has, and not just give up, but sort of flare into these, like, going from the bright, determined anger that he has, and then settle into, like, coals of resentment. Does that make sense? Because right now what he's got going is actual fire. He's got passion, wants to do the thing, and even when he's being told it can't be done, it doesn't matter. It's either try or stop trying, which is not an option to him. And she has kind of stopped trying. And so she wants somebody to commiserate with. It's, like the misery loves company thing. I think it can be taken as just miserable people want everyone around them to be miserable. But I really think, like, that's oversimplifying a complex thing that happens where if you are miserable, there's often valid reasons for feeling that way. And you want validation that you have the right to be miserable, that things are fucked up and unfair, and acknowledgement of that. And it seems like she has been in a situation where she is alone and has been sort of discarded, and she sees this guy coming in with no knowledge, wanting to, like, reach these heights. And there's almost like, first of all, how dare you? Second of all, this would be funny if it weren't pathetic. And third of all, you're just going to get disappointed because you don't understand how much is up against you. And I'm going to disabuse you of your assertions and assumptions here, which I'll enjoy doing because you seem to think that I'm stuck at Emberling for my own, like, foolishness or lack of attempt at growing, when actually there's real reasons why I haven't been able to get past this. So sort of just proving to him in a way that she's where she is due to outside circumstances and that it's not her fault. And really there's a point where it's like, it isn't her fault because circumstances have been shitty, and I can understand after everything that she has gone through how she feels beaten down. He's, like, brand new to this fucking world. He's basically, like, a month old at this point, like, put into the terms that we can, in terms of his, like, understanding of how any of this magic functions. And she has been out working with it for years and years and years. So, yeah, she's going to be at this point where she's grown cynical, and understandably so. And sometimes you also just want to keep it, like, somebody from getting their hopes up the way that your hopes were up. But there's a kind of gleefulness to the way that she's approaching, informing him about all of it, that doesn't feel like it's about protecting him. It feels like almost I get to inflict on him what was inflicted on me. And there can be a very petulant, immature satisfaction in that. So, anyway, that's the way that I took this whole thing. She says, applying pressure to your heart is going to be the next step. I'm exceptionally good at making people realize the reality of their shortcomings. So, she agrees to meet him the next day. And he stays in this little, like, weird sort of room that he's been living in and is working with this coal mana. And he has a hard time focusing and is just kind of stops and is just like, what is the point of all of this? What am I trying to actually do? And he considers other options for getting near this, like, iron mana. And there's a point when he even floats the idea of getting a job at the academy, the temple. I'm not really even sure I guess is the academy attached to the temple? Are they both called the same thing? But he, and this was the first thing that I also thought, assumes probably they do some sort of screening process and that there would be no way that somebody who's a red lister is going to be able to get a job there because they would find out who he was pretty quickly. And that was also what I thought. And then he thinks about going to like the different houses. A bitter taste soured his mouth. No, he hadn't fought this hard for his freedom to exchange it so quickly for a new form of servitude. The houses were out for now. And I kind of respected that, you know. It's making it harder on yourself, but also it would probably be pretty difficult to get out of a deal with a house once you're in it. And if you go into it knowing that you're going to want to get out of it, instead of going into it thinking like, let me try and make myself useful so I can rise up the ranks and make this my life, I feel like that's probably not going to go as well for you. So I think that was the right call. Okay, so Dan is saying you go to the academy after being resurrected at the Archspire. Right, so the Archspire is the temple where all of their little like plinths are that they were born onto. And then they go to the academy, which is where we saw Lianxi in her interlude. Got it. And she had gotten into her little locker that had her journals and whatnot in it. Could he compensate with his deficiencies with extreme training? But no, according to Naomi, training helped ignite the heart, but only once it was saturated. Nor did it deepen his reserves. Training was an accelerant. The harder you trained, the faster you progressed, but it couldn't compensate for the fact that he'd be working with coal. Well, if there was one thing he could do, it was work at saturating his heart. So he sits down and begins to just try and meditate on that again, which sounds like the kind of process that would give me a headache after a while, the kind of interior focus that you have to have. But the next day, Naomi comes in and is like, oh, you're still here. I thought maybe you'd have quit and left. And when he's like, well, I'm not going to quit. Come on. And she's like, well, that's the first test. It is the easiest one, but still, we're going to go up to the roof to train. And she says, why do we train? And he says, to become frustrated and spur growth. Correct. But not any frustration will do. You wish to ignite your heart and grow in power. The frustration you feel as you work with coal is good for your growth, but it pales in comparison to the benefits of physical conflict. Why? And she asks him to hit her. And at first he kind of does like a fake out, like she wasn't serious when she told him to hit her. But when he realizes that she's getting irritated, he finally does. And she manages to, of course, dodge him pretty easily. We train at fighting because nothing concentrates the mind so wonderfully as pain and avoiding death. What, then, is better than training? A real fight? She nodded. And if that is the best way to advance, why bother with training? Because you must fight a superior opponent to benefit, and in a real fight, that'll mean your death. So, this scene is mostly him trying to hit her, thinking that he is getting the advantage over her and pressing her into a corner, and then her transforming and absolutely whooping the ever-living shit out of him. This man is one big bruise by the end of this. He is absolutely laid out. There's no pausing in here for a little Gatorade and a power bar. Dude is going as long as he can go before he is straight up on his back and unable to rise again. And I love this line that she says, you'd be surprised how many ways there are to quit. If you're not hungry enough, you'll find a way to convince yourself to stop sooner or later. I felt so attacked. Can I just tell you? Oh my God, you guys. Like, there was just something about that I was just like, you're really getting personal Okay? Because I think that I have managed a pretty, I think, clever, but it's actually just me harming myself. So who am I outsmarting but myself, which that does not help me. But I think I have managed to work the language around some of my own choosing to quit in my life so as to rationalize and make it seem as if quitting wasn't what I was actually doing. And that's not everything. There are times where quitting is what you should do. Some things aren't for you, and you are testing out and seeing what direction you want to go in your life and realize that's not the one, and you change gears and quit that one thing, and that's fine. But then there are things that the reality is simply that it's hard, and that can be uncomfortable and, frustrating, and you just find a way to tell yourself it's not a big deal that you stopped trying. And the ways in which you can do that are varied, and you get smarter and smarter at like framing that to yourself to convince you that it's not quitting, because you're just trying to rationalize. That's all that's going on. So anyway, I just really like that line. And she says, "Give up. You're outside the academy. You'll never be anything but a third-rate cinder at best." He wanted to say something defiant that would take her by surprise, but all he could do was stand there trying not to vomit. So she gives him a 1-minute break. And we've not found my threshold yet. Sit. Now, saturate your heart with coal. Now. So he does it. He tries again. And with his current state, it's difficult and kind of agonizing. A taste of what you must be able to do if you want to be taken seriously in this world. Where did she think he'd go if he quit? There was nowhere to go. "All right," he said, raising his battered arms. "I'm ready." She looked back at him, surprised. An emotion he couldn't read flickered across her face and then was gone. "Very well, it's your funeral." And that emotion, I feel, might be almost like there's a complex thing that happens here, but I feel like it's a combo of longing, wishing that she still had that drive, admiration, and maybe guilt at realizing that, not that she's trying to stop him, but guilt that she has given up on herself. And the fact that he is pushing when hope doesn't seem to exist is a reminder that she could have kept trying and didn't. But yeah, I just really liked that moment. So eventually, like I said, he gets to this point where he is absolutely unable to stand. He manages to, after a break, drag himself to his water bucket and drink, even though he really wants to dump that shit over his head, which I understand. A big part of me was just dunk your head in it and then drink it while your head's underwater. Just fucking go for it, because that's basically what my dog does. Pippin, apparently this is a thing with a lot of huskies. They cool down by dunking their heads in water and putting their paws in water. So if there is at the dog park, he gets heated up playing and running. If I have a bucket of water, he will just put both paws in it and dunk his whole entire head in it and make it filthy. And then he wants to drink out of it. And if it's good enough for Pippin, I say it's good enough for you there, Scorio. But it turns out Naomi is still here. And she's watching him and says, "Are you sure you want to continue? Why do you want power?" And he's like, "Well, you told me people find that out later, great souls." And she's like, "Yeah, but you're not like most of them. You're alone and you're weak and you have no future. You're asking for unrelenting pain and abuse that will allow you to crawl over the starting line but not get much further. Why bother? There's nothing else for me." Not good enough. You saying the moment you find an alternative, you'll take it? No. Then, I want to prove them wrong. Better, but very limited. You can't base your growth on other people's opinions. It's a start. Fine, you want to prove them wrong about what? About me. They threw me away, sent me into the dark to die like a rabid animal. Sure, so you want to, what, get revenge? They threw you away like a rabid animal because you're a red lister. Now you want to get revenge on them. Haven't you realized that by doing so, you'll be proving them right? Proving them right? They started it. Now you sound like a child. Scorio, I'll level with you. You know I've been trying to get you to quit. I was sure you would. But somehow you're still sitting there across from me, more determined than ever. And that conversation was really fascinating because that's the question I face a lot personally with why I want to get fitter. And this has been an ongoing battle for me in my life as somebody who has always struggled with body image and weight. How much my achieving certain goals and reaching certain milestones has been for the validation of others, for the approval of others. And even when I was weightlifting at the gym, what motivated me so much of the time when I was at a gym with other people was the way that they would look at me as a fat person at a gym, either derision or pity or just a sort of contempt, and wanting to prove these fuckers wrong and just outperforming, like in a Zumba class, being the only one who managed to make it to the end of a set when everybody else had just completely collapsed because it was too intense. I got to a point where what I was doing was just trying to say fuck you to everybody else. And while it was effective for a while, it also served to make me more aware of other people's opinions. And that isn't sustainable. And that doesn't help with your own body image. It helps get you started, but it's not enough to keep you going. And developing my own reasons that are only for me and not visible or based on anybody else's expectation or opinion has been really challenging, because so much of what we do for our bodies is visible to the people around us that it begins to take an out of proportion priority to what is happening internally. And it's a really good question. Like, why do you want to go for runs and do yoga and get fitter? Is it just so that the people around you will be like, oh, she's fat, but she's in decent shape. I'm surprised. I didn't think that was possible. And to like prove to them that you are a species that exists? Well, then what? Once they know that, then what? Do you just stop? I mean, you've got to have more than that, you know? So, yeah, Dan is in the chat saying, my dog's reaction to rain is to turn around and try to go back inside, even if it's a sprinkle. I've bounced up and down 50 pounds most of my life. You're speaking truth. Wanting to be a healthy weight just for yourself is hard as fuck. It really is. It really is. And it's that motivation and finding like the heart of it. And I have finally at this point in my life begun to suffer genuine health setbacks because of my weight. And it's not like if I simply increased my cardiovascular endurance or anything that it would go away. It's the actual weight on my body that is causing issues. And so now I'm beginning to approach trying to lose weight as much more of a genuine, this is for my health. And it was like difficult for me to say it's for my own health. I'm caring for myself and believe it, because for so long in my life, I would say it was for my health when really what I meant was to look healthy, which is not the same thing at all. At all. But I conflated them, and it was really about aesthetic, and I just was not being entirely honest with myself. So now when I say it's for my health, it's coming from a completely different place, but it sounds the same on the surface, and I have had to grapple with the fact that it isn't the same, and to trust myself, because I have lied to myself for so long that trusting myself about this sort of thing is really, really difficult. And you just get to a point where you have to take that leap and trust yourself. So anyway, this is when we get Naomi's story, and this is really fascinating to me. She says, I wasn't reborn into the academy. I was born the natural way in Bastion. My father was a high-level bureaucrat in House Kraken. I grew up in Ward 6, well cared for, tutors groomed for house duty, the works. I have an igneous heart, but everybody does. Everyone out there, from the lowest beggar to the richest plutocrat. But they're raised in coal and told they can't do better. Nobody tries. And most of them have hearts with such low reactivity that nothing would happen even if they dedicated their lives to ignition. And this is really interesting, the fact that everybody has one. With weak hearts and nothing but coal or copper, 999 in 1,000 would never amount to anything unless they were given huge resources and dedicated their lives to training. So I like this. It's a combo of what is innate in you, the kind of heart you have, and whether you got lucky, basically, with the type of heart you were born with, and then the circumstances of where you happen to live. And that's also kind of like getting lucky, and it's something that you could change, allegedly, but also mostly out of your control. So a lot of this is just sort of like luck. It's just straight up, you know? She says, my father is an angry man. He never accepted being worth less than the great souls who were given 10 times as much for 10 times less work. So he used his considerable resources to acquire elixirs for me, condensed mana of high quality, all kinds of things. It's not strictly illegal, though it ruined his career. Fortunately for him, I was born with an especially reactive heart. I prospered and against all odds, ignited my heart at the age of 9. And yet, I'm just an emberling. They admitted me to the academy. Better to pretend I was one of their own than a rogue element they couldn't control. But though they called me a prodigy, they never treated me like one. My training was neglected. I was told to develop character by being part of the cleaning crew. I served the other great souls each and every year that a new cohort was reborn. In time, I think they even forgot I was meant to be trained at all. And my father grew furious, but his protests only ruined his career further. Just as I was informed that making too much noise would hurt my family. So for long years, I stayed quiet and mopped and cleaned and peeled and walked in the shadows, a cinder that nobody paid any mind to. Scorio listened, fascinated. But something changed. It did. I grew older, made friends that I lost, and even had the gall to fall in love. And for a while, even my little world gleamed with gold and seemed enchanted until I realized what a fool I was and had enough. What happened? Her eyes turned cold. None of your business. But it was enough to propel me to my first trial. I passed it and manifested my emberling power. That form that you've seen that becomes me so, well, hard to ignore. What did they do, the trainers? I don't know. I left before they could disappoint me again. I knew my father would never forgive my giving up, as he called it, so I came here instead, which is the point of this whole heartwarming tale. I'm about the least qualified person to train you in all of Bastion. I was spoon-fed elixirs until my heart had no choice but to burn, then ignored and abused till I quit and fled for these ruins. So you ask me why I was trying to make you quit? Because I have almost no idea how to train you. Want me to put together a regimen of high-quality treasures to push you past your limits? I can make some excellent, if outdated, suggestions you'll never get to act on. Want advice on the best way to mop a kitchen floor at 3 a.m? I'm your girl. Want concrete advice on how to train and improve yourself to remain on par, if not better than those academy monsters? You'll have to look somewhere else. And I want to know what happened, because I am going to hazard a guess that she fell in love with somebody who was using her and she found out. That either they held her in contempt, that they were using her for something, or that it was simply sort of just them like fucking with her, depending on their personality. So yeah, this is just like a really bummer story that feels genuine, and the fact that she quit and Scorio hasn't, I don't feel like that makes Scorio better, because let's be real, he hasn't been at it that long yet. So, let's wait and see for a minute. So this is when she says, I've ceased growing in power because I've come to accept the wall I've run into. Run out of ambition? Become a realist, she corrected. There's nothing but coal out here. Coal and fiends and endless days in which to brood over the injustices of the world. Doesn't have to be that way. We're alive against all the odds. Surely, Scorio. Save the heartwarming speech. You don't know anything about anything. I was actually born into this world, raised in it. I've seen how it works. Been broken by the system you're so blithely deciding to, get revenge on? But what does that even mean? Forget the revenge. Success is its own vengeance. Let's just focus on getting powerful. Once we have power, we can dictate our own terms. And she just kind of is like, yeah, that's adorable to this whole thing. But again, when she's just like, why? What terms would you set? He yells, I don't know. But I won't hide out here like some whipped dog waiting for death and nursing my grievances. Nursing my grievances. Okay. Ouch again. Shot to the heart. I'm going to figure out what I can do, and then I'll bloody well do it. Again and again and again, until I've got some control over my own life. I won't let people discard me, decide my worth. I won't watch as they do it to others, or pull them into these rotten systems when they don't know any better. I'll fight. Maybe it's pointless. Maybe you're right and we'll get nowhere. But if I had thought that from the beginning, I'd already be dead. Instead, I'm here, on the verge of igniting my heart, which I thought was impossible until a few days ago. So yes, I'm going to keep trying, because there's no saying how far it'll get me. And I plan to use the entirety of my pathetic life to find out. Naomi's eyes were wide, her face pale. So, yeah, I think that him sort of pointing out that ultimately her deciding this is as far as I get to go is her misusing her life. Like, that's not what he says, but that's the ultimate, if you're going to track his thoughts to what she's doing. He sees it as her just wasting away. And I don't think that she has given it enough thought to see it that way. I don't think that she has looked ahead in terms of like what living the way she has been will mean ultimately enough to really stop and consider if this is how she wants to live. I think she's just kind of just moving from day to day with this same anger in her, and letting that blinker her to the point that a decade goes by and she hasn't grown or done anything. And instead of seeing it as, I haven't grown or done anything different because I have chosen not to act, instead she's seeing it as, I haven't grown at all because I have been kept from growth. And two things can be true. She can be kept from growth and she can have given up. You know, this is actually really, really close to a conversation that I had with Rashawn recently, because I'm in the relationship with Rashawn, I'm more a Scorio and she's more a Naomi. She has been given a fucking bad deck in life, dealt some really, really bad cards. And it's fucking unfair. And she does not deserve the shit that she is being expected to, like, get through. But there is also a part of her that has sort of given up. And as much as I really understand that, and I am not in a position to say that I would have handled things differently, because my life experience has been a lot cozier than hers in many ways. I am just of a personality type where I'm always trying to improve. I always am making attempts, even if I'm feeling down and frustrated. That desire is always there. And it's something that she has a lot of trouble relating to with me. So when we talk, a lot of times I'll be being like, oh, I'm doing this and that. And she's like, that sounds good. I wish I cared enough to do that. You know, like this just felt like a very familiar sort of conversation. And then when he starts talking about, like, the fact that the closer you get to the pit, the richer the mana is. And he's like, well, why don't we just fucking go to the pit? She's like, because there's a thing called the curse. It fucks you up. She says it makes you, like, your judgment and reasoning is off. You'll have, like, a sense of euphoria and almost overconfidence. You'll get distracted by random ideas and stuff. You'll eventually start hallucinating and eventually fall unconscious and die. So that's why only the greatest of great souls can actually get to the pit. I've got more resistance than you do, but no way am I getting close enough to, like, do anything with that mana out there. So she says we will have to get fake papers to allow us to exit Bastion and find a way to both survive on the plains and evade notice. Great, that's a plan we can work on. And she's like, well, you should ignite your heart first. And he's like, but you said doing it with Cole would make it. And she's like, that having an ignited heart on Cole is better than not an ignited heart at all if we're going to be doing that. So yes, just try and reach that. And she says, based on what I've seen from you and heard about what your titles used to be, you have talent. So maybe in a month or two, you could do it if you really fucking focused. And she says, when you begin the path toward your first trial, you'll develop your first power. And when he says, tell me more about that, she just goes, no, you don't need to think about that at all. Don't think too far ahead, which I think is always good advice. And this is when he says, say I ignite my heart and become a cinder, would you be willing to escape with me? And she is straight up, like, flipped out by this suggestion. This is a fascinating moment because it seems for him, doesn't have to think twice about asking her to do this. Whereas for her, she's like, you're a fucking stranger. You don't know what you're doing. You don't know what you're asking of me. And I feel like I'm assuming she is feeling some fear at the suggestion that she try again because it has not worked out. And she says, don't toy with me. And he says, I'm not. All I'm asking is that you consider it. So she says she'll consider it. And then you'll have to survive the next week first. So more training. And the way that this, like, the use of mana and the way that he can feel it moving even when he's not in touch with his heart, I think is really interesting. Like when she takes on her other form, he senses that movement around him of the mana like being pulled toward her as a sort of wind. And she talks a little bit about the melee training and why it's important. Advancement through the ranks requires one thing and one thing only: ambition fueled by an inexhaustible will. Training the body by learning martial arts hones the will by forcing you to learn discipline, self-control, and focus. Because she's also pointing out the fact that, like, once you reach a point where you've got other powers, you won't need to get in close enough to have, like, hand-to-hand combat with people. But you'll still want to do this training because it'll be important to you. So there's a night where he builds a fire and is talking. She's been sending him on runs and sprints because she says that he has, like, no stamina, and is telling him to build that up. And he mentions Bastion and it's dying. And it's like, why is this happening? And she's like, there's a whole lot of theories. People think that the portal closed, that there was, like, once it closed, that there was some sort of energy coming through it that had kept us alive. But now that we don't get it, it's withering up. Some people are thinking it's like a plan. But it's been going on for centuries. And the city has perhaps 10 years before it's consumed. And he's like, what? Is that it? And this made me think of, I was reading an article yesterday because somebody shared a link to this house in Nantucket that was going for $600,000. And it had been listed like a few months earlier at $2.5 million. But it turns out they experienced 75 feet of coastal erosion in front of this house in 2 months. And so essentially you buy the house and it will be gone probably within a year. Like the land that it's on will be underwater, but it's still going for $600,000. And it was an article that just talked about erosion in Nantucket overall and the fact that so many homes are reaching this point where they have to be demolished because they are not on solid ground anymore. And they've lost a total of like 5 square miles in, I don't remember how many years, but it just reminded me so much of that. And the portal, the talk about this is just, it was open somewhat frequently and then fewer and fewer times it would open. And then eventually it just stopped altogether. And she says the imperial prophecy had everyone excited on that front. The whole city was ready to celebrate a few years back. It foretold the day the imperators would crush the true fiends and collapse the pit, and the houses, the great souls, everyone made a big push. Then it all went wrong. The imperators were thrown back. There was big loss, and it's been revolution in the streets and denial in the halls of power ever since. So that was what the other two, Phaon, is that her name? And Helena were talking about. Supposedly, the prophecy was from great souls a few centuries back. Regardless, it failed. So, it turns out like the academy where everybody is training at this point is newer. It's been there for like 2,000 years almost. Or no, she says 2/3 of a millennium, so 700 years. But yeah, it's newer. And this made me sort of wonder, if you found the ruins of the other academy, will there be iron mana there still from when it used to be functional? I don't know. But this is when he brings up the black star petals. And she's like, you would need like 50 of them to make one pill. And he's like, okay, let's say I get 50. Could you make a pill? And she's like, well, I couldn't, but I know an alchemist who probably could do it, but it'll take you fucking forever to find them. And he's like, well, let me just give it a shot. Like, if you're not willing to give me my sapphire vials back, then I'll go find them. And then there's this mention, and this is the great souls keeping journals, keeping treasures for their future selves. Common practice, as was raiding the lockers of famous great souls once they died for their loot, was one of the first ways I became disenchanted with the academy. Technically, your locker is meant to be inviolate, but it was sickening how often the trainers or more powerful students would raid a locker when word reached them of a notorious great soul's death. Of course, that also meant that most great souls didn't bother leaving anything of much worth in their lockers once they realized the truth, so it's not nearly as amazing a cache of treasure as you might think. And then he mentions, what are the odds of me being able to, like, get somebody to smuggle me in to see my locker? And she says, who would do that? I'm not sure they would, but there's no harm in asking, right? So the next, and I'm out of time here really, but the next section in this chapter is really mostly Scorio finding these flowers, fighting creatures, and doing his sprints and runs and whatnot. So I feel okay with mostly like skipping over this and just mentioning the fact that he is still using the chalk here for defense and whatnot. Wondering if he's ever going to get like the bridge and stuff back, and the metal bar. But the chapter ends with 1 down, 49 more to go, because he finally finds one of those flowers. So again, she's just like, what's the point? And he's like, what's the point of not? I may as well. What else am I going to do? And I'll be interested to see what her reaction is at seeing the fact that he managed to find one right away, you know? So yeah, these were really fun chapters. I'm looking forward to seeing, hopefully, Naomi get some, like, have a refresh of faith. I don't know how long it'll take for her to really believe in it, but I hope that she starts to, like, I hesitate to even say trust him more, but just even trust in herself more, you know, to care more and hope more. So I'm going to wrap up. Thank you guys so much for hanging out with me. Thank you, Dan, again, for commissioning this. Appreciate you a lot. And until next time, toodaloo, motherfuckers.
That was an Unspoiled Network podcast.